Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, I thought that I would review this little video by this one channel called Fannon International Boxing. And he's going to be having a little bit of a conversation about what Terence Crawford recently said about Canelo Alvarez. Now, of course, Terence Crawford, he has a very, very big upcoming fight next month. I believe the date is November 20th. And on that date, he will be facing Sean Porter, which, in my opinion, is going to be a real barometer test of where both Sean Porter and Terence Crawford are in terms of the greats. Now, Sean Porter, he pretty much is a guy that, he is a great fighter, but he is a guy overall to where he's probably never going to beat those guys that could debatably be looked at as the number one guys in the division. Because every time he's faced a guy like that, he pretty much lost, whether it be against Kell Brook or Keith Thurman or Earl Spence Jr. But it's not like Sean Porter never got any big wins in his career. He did beat Paulie Malignaggi, if you count that as a big win. He beat Devin Alexander, and he was a very good contender. And, of course, the biggest win of his career, he defeated Danny Garcia. So Sean Porter, he is a real deal fighter. He is a real deal welterweight. And in my opinion, Sean Porter, this is probably going to be the first definitive A-class fight that Terence Crawford has ever had in his career. Because every other fight that I've seen Terence Crawford in, I'm not saying that maybe he has not fought some talented fighters, but let's be real. The biggest fighters in Terence Crawford's career that he's fought have been Yuriorkis Gamboa, Ricky Burns, and Victor Postol. And those guys, I'm sorry, but those guys are just not A-grade fighters. I think that they're decent fighters, but they're not A-grade fighters. It is what it is. So this is going to be a major test to see where does Terence Crawford rank in terms of the stratosphere, in terms of the other fighters around him. And I like Terence Crawford, even though I criticize him here and there. Like I said, I got a lot of love for Terence Crawford. He's from my hometown of Omaha, Nebraska, for those of you that don't know. And I think that he's a fantastic fighter. But this dude, he sure talks a lot of shit on some of these other fighters for a guy that really has nowhere near the resume as some of these guys out here. And I think that Terence Crawford, I think that he's a great fighter. But I need to see how great he is against some of these A-grade fighters. Because if we're talking about him compared to a Canelo Alvarez, and even a few other fighters that I have on my pound-for-pound list, I cannot have him within my top four. And a certain amount of people, they may disagree. But resume, to me, is the most important category out of them all. And when we talk about Canelo Alvarez, there really is no comparison. When you talk about Alexander Usyk, to me, there really is no comparison. He had that great win over Anthony Joshua, who, in my opinion, was a clear A-class fighter. And on top of that, when it came down to it, Usyk, he also completely unified the cruiserweight division. That was pretty decently talented at the time. He got a couple of very good wins at heavyweight, and then he pretty much just dominated Anthony Joshua. Anthony Joshua would have been on my top 10 pound-for-pound list before that loss. And on top of that, I think he would have been on a multitude of other top 10 pound-for-pound lists as well. So that one has to be counted very, very big. Tyson Fury, in my opinion, has to be counted over Terence Crawford because he has two A-class level wins, of course, over Deontay Wilder and over Vladimir Klitschko. And Vladimir Klitschko, at the time when he was beat by Tyson Fury, I believe was looked at as like the number 2 pound-for-pound fighter or somewhere within the top 5 on pretty much every list. So he has to be above, in my opinion, on the list. And Errol Spence Jr. does as well. Errol Spence Jr. has wins over Sean Porter, Danny Garcia, Mikey Garcia, Kell Brook. Each and every single one of those fighters were A-grade fighters when Errol Spence fought them and pretty much dominated them. So I have to give Errol Spence a hell of a lot of credit. I have to give those other fighters a hell of a lot of credit. I think that Terence is a great fighter, but I cannot have him any higher than number 5 on my pound-for-pound list because his resume, it really leaves a lot to be desired. It is what it is. But anyways, Terence Crawford, he's going to be talking on Canelo Alvarez, and he says overall that the reason why he believes that he's pound for pound over Canelo, I mean, I'm sure he naturally somewhat believes that he's the best fighter in the world anyway, which I don't really have a problem with. But Terence Crawford, a big part of the reason why he believes he also should be ranked over Canelo Alvarez is that Canelo Alvarez, of course, there is a little bit of a controversy over is he still on PEDs? And, of course, one point in time, he was caught on PEDs. So it is what it is. Whether that's enough to you to not rank him number 1 pound for pound, that's up to you. To me personally, I don't think that it's enough. And a certain amount of people may disagree, but I keep the same energy whenever it comes to any other sport. If it comes to UFC, and we all know John Jones, he's tested positive for steroids about 15 separate times, and that dude has gotten in more trouble than any other UFC fighter that I personally ever seen. And he's been in the news recently for allegedly abusing his wife. Whether it's true or not, who the hell knows? I may do a video on that a little bit later on. But when it comes down to the overall, I can sit here and make the same argument and say, well, John Jones, in my opinion, he can never be in the greatest of all time conversation because of how many times he got tested, for PEDs, or how many times he tested positive for PEDs. I understand certain people who want to go with that argument, but to me, when it comes down to it, I believe that a lot of these fighters are on PEDs anyway, when it comes down to it. And on top of that, when you take a look at Canelo Alvarez, he very obviously is a very, very skilled fighter. That's not me saying that, of course, performance-enhancing drugs or PEDs, of course, maybe would not strip a little credit away, because, of course, they do, enhance your performance. That's why they're called performance enhancers. But when it comes down to the overall, like I said, Canelo Alvarez, I mean, he's tested clean for the majority of his bouts. And on top of that, when you just take a look at Canelo Alvarez, you can just tell that he's the #1 pound-for-pound boxer today. And when you take a look at his resume, there's no other resume today. When you talk about a boxer in their prime that is fighting today, there's no other boxer that compares to Canelo Alvarez's resume. I'm sorry, there just isn't. It is what it is. So Terence Crawford, he's going to be talking about it overall, or Fannon, he's going to be talking about it, I guess, what Terence Crawford talked about. I'm going to tune in a little bit as well. Let's see what he has to say.
All right, welcome back to the channel. So Terence Crawford went all the way there with Canelo Alvarez in an interview with DAZN. He asked him what meat you've been eating when he's addressing whether or not he, Terence Crawford, should be #1 pound for pound or Canelo Alvarez. Let's talk about that in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel, man. Terence Crawford, score 1 for Terence Crawford, man. Terence Crawford comes out really, really hard in this interview that he does with DAZN. There's a big fight coming up in November between Terence Crawford and Sean Porter. So he's out making the rounds on the interviews. So, you're getting a lot of questions asked for him about Aerospin.
And if some of you were to ask me, do I believe that the Sean Porter win, if Terence Crawford does get that win, because, a lot of people, they take a look at Sean Porter and they don't look at him as that great of a fighter. But Sean Porter, if you're not careful, he can hurt you and he can give you a hell of a fight. One thing I'll say about Sean Porter is this. He has pretty much lost almost every A-plus fight in his career, whether it be against Kell Brook or Keith Thurman or Errol Spence Jr. But let's also give Sean Porter some credit. He gave every single one of those fighters hell. Every single one of those fighters hell. No doubt about it. So Terence, he's going to have a very, very big test ahead of him. We'll see what happens.
It's about Canelo Alvarez, about Sean.
But do I believe that if he were to beat Sean Porter, that in my opinion would put him higher on my list, or that would put him above Canelo Alvarez? Not necessarily. In fact, I don't think that it would even put him higher on my list at all. That doesn't mean that I don't like Terence Crawford or that, overall that I'm trying to purposely put him lower on my list. But Sean Porter at this point in time, I mean, if we're just asking overall where he ranks pound for pound, well, Sean Porter certainly cannot be in the top 10 pound for pound because he's not a champion. And on top of that, you have 3 losses in your career already. So where exactly do you rank him? I mean, Sean Porter, he can debatably be in the top 20 pound for pound, maybe top 30. So like I said, this is going to be hands down the biggest win of Terence Crawford's career if he beats Sean Porter. But the reason why I can't have Terence Crawford that high on my list is because out of all the other fighters that are within my top 5, Terence Crawford is the only one that is debatably never defeated a top 10 pound for pound fighter when they were in the top 10 pound for pound. Maybe Gamboa on some lists, but even then I'm not sure if he was there. And Gamboa I thought was a decent fighter, but Gamboa, in my opinion, all it was really going to take for him to lose, in my opinion, and some of you may disagree, all it was going to take was Gamboa to really face an A-grade fighter to finally lose. Because Gamboa, although he was decently talented, he's not on that same level as a Guillermo Rigondeaux or an Araceli Lara. Gamboa is a person that has a lot of flaws. He is a person overall that, first of all, is a little bit chinny. That's why he got knocked down in so many of his fights when it came down to it. You can go ahead and look at the highlights for that. There are certain videos on that. And secondly, Gamboa gets in these offensive brawls where he gets a little bit too wild and crazy to the point to where he does not keep his hands up and he does not watch out for incoming punches. And all in all, he gets knocked down and he'll get hurt and he'll get knocked out. And that's basically what happened against Terence Crawford. Terence Crawford was the first actual great fighter that Yuriorkis Gamboa really ever fought. And he gave Terence Crawford a hell of a fight. But at the end of the day, Terence Crawford proved to be the greater fighter. A certain amount of people, they say that Terence Crawford, maybe he won because he was a little bit bigger and Gamboa had the layoff. Sure, you can say that that's a part of it. But Gamboa, all in all, he's really proven to be a person that, he's a tough fighter, but he's very, very flawed. And Gamboa, in my opinion, I thought that he was a decent fighter once upon a time, but Yuriorkis Gamboa, had he faced, I don't care who it would have been, if he would have faced someone like a Vasyl Lomachenko, even when he was undefeated, or a Mikey Garcia, even someone who was not a Terence Crawford who had, that type of size, Gamboa would have never beat those guys in his prime, in my opinion. He's just too flawed. He's too chinny on top of that, and when it comes down to it, he's very defensively irresponsible.
Porter.
And to this day, that is Terence Crawford's biggest win of his career.
And this one particular segment where he's asked about Canelo Alvarez, honestly, man, I got to take my hat off to the dude because, he is being a lot more interactive with the media. And sometimes Terence Crawford says stuff that I don't like, but sometimes I'm just like, hey, man, you can't be more direct to the point than that. And in this particular instance, man, I don't think the dude could be more correct. So he was asked about the pound-for-pound comparisons between himself and Canelo Alvarez. As you guys know, a whole lot of people in the established media, ESPN, Ring Magazine, say that Canelo Alvarez is the number one pound-for-pound fighter in boxing. Some people say that he's the face of boxing, all that stuff, right, that comes.
He's pretty much both. Like I said, Canelo Alvarez, in my opinion, he very clearly is the face of boxing. And on top of that, he is the number one pound-for-pound fighter. Like I said, I don't see another fighter in the world today that can claim, or at least overall, I mean, there's going to be certain fighters that claim it, of course, and I don't necessarily have a problem with that. If you're a fighter, you should believe that you're the best fighter in the world, especially if you're on the level of a Usyk or a Canelo or a Fury or a Crawford or a Spence, someone along those lines. Even if you're on the level of a Josh Taylor or, someone who may be a little bit lower on my pound-for-pound list. But when it comes down to the overall, Terence, like I said, he can claim that he's the number one pound-for-pound fighter all he wants to, and I get it. But at the end of the day, resume matters, and resume is the most important category. So many of these people, they always love to say, well, Terence, he looks so dominant compared to Canelo Alvarez. Well, let's be real. I mean, not only does Canelo Alvarez look very, very dominant, superbly dominant, but when it comes down to it, Canelo is facing higher grade competition on average than what Terence Crawford is facing. Let's be real. Even if we want to just take a look at the welterweight division, like, who has he really fought there? You defeated Jeff Horn, who, of course, he had that, okay win over Manny, or I'm not going to say okay win, but he had a decent win over Manny Pacquiao. But I believe that was a Manny Pacquiao that heavily underestimated him. And here's also my point. People overall, they can say, well, Jeff Horn, he had that great win over Manny Pacquiao. That's great, but how many people overall, how many people actually believe that Jeff Horn, even with that belt, how many of you believe that he would have beat a Danny Garcia? How many of you believe that he would have beat Sean Porter or Keith Thurman or Kell Brook or Terence Crawford or any of those other guys, Errol Spence Jr.? Like, yeah, there's certain fighters that, they're real deal champions, like what Canelo was facing next in the Caleb Plant. And then there's just fighters that won a belt, like Jeff Horn. Jeff Horn, no offense against him. He has a lot of grit. He's very tough, but that was just a dude that just won a belt.
With being probably the number one money earner in boxing and a very, very good fighter without a doubt. But Terence Crawford cuts to the chase when they do the comparison. And he says, look, I'm not ashamed to say it. It's in my meat. What's in the meat? What's in your meat, right? Which pretty much means, man, look, Canelo Alvarez is on performance-enhancing drugs, and I'm a clean fighter. So if you want to do pound-for-pound comparisons, I'm the number one pound-for-pound fighter in the world because I'm not caught up in any of that stuff.
That's great, but at the end of the day, like I said, if you're ranking a pound-for-pound list, and if you're not going to put Canelo Alvarez as the number one pound-for-pound because of the PEDs, no problem. But then you shouldn't have Canelo Alvarez on your pound-for-pound list at all. because in my opinion, it kind of should work like this. If you're a person where you don't like PED users, or you don't like people overall that have tested positive for PEDs in the past, then you shouldn't have any fighters on your pound for pound list that have tested positive for PEDs, because then basically what that means is that Canelo Alvarez, in your opinion, he can only be ranked over Terence Crawford or only ranked over Spence or certain fighters that you like, once they lose. So basically what that means is that, or some of these guys, they always love to supersede certain fighters over Canelo or these other fighters, and they always continue using the same excuse. Well, all in all, I can't put them number one because they use PEDs. So what are you going to do if Terence Crawford loses? Or if Errol Spence Jr. loses? What are you going to do? Are you just going to put another fighter over Canelo Alvarez? Or are you going to finally say, oh, well, he's clearly number one now because Terence and Errol Spence have lost? I'm sorry, but that's just not the way my list works. I understand it to a degree, but in my opinion, if you're a person that does not want to rank Canelo number one just because of the PEDs, you should not have him on your list at all.
Now, I know that may hurt some people's feelings, and but it really shouldn't, man. First and foremost, even if you took away the performance-enhancing drug thing from Canelo Alvarez, and you look at Terence Crawford and you look at Canelo Alvarez, and you see how these guys handle themselves in the ring and what they do in the ring, there's really a lot of arguments that Terence Crawford, pound for pound, is a better fighter than Canelo Alvarez. Number one,
I don't think so. I think people on the know that don't know a whole lot about boxing, I think that they think that. But when I take a look at both Canelo Alvarez and Terence Crawford, there is no debate to me who is the better fighter. I think that Terence Crawford, I think that he's a fantastic fighter. But when I see Canelo Alvarez handle his business versus Terence Crawford, Canelo Alvarez, in my opinion, is a more complete fighter. Terence Crawford, he has a couple flaws in his style as well. He actually is more defensively irresponsible than what Canelo Alvarez is. Go ahead and take a look at him. Overall, I believe in that last fight against Kell Brook, he got hit up quite a few times within that 4-round fight, especially by right hands. He's very vulnerable to right hands. Terence Crawford sometimes leaves his chin way too wide open in the air, way too high in the air. He needs to have his chin a hell of a lot more tucked. And on top of that, sometimes he needs to keep his hands up a hell of a lot more. When I took a look at Canelo Alvarez in his last fight against Billy Joe Saunders, that dude could not get hit with almost any flush punches from Billy Joe Saunders. And Billy Joe Saunders, he's not a dude that has elite power, but he's a person overall that can somewhat hold you back, and on top of that, he has very good hand speed. And Canelo, his defense was so great in that fight. It's really to the point now to where it's like, if you're going to beat Canelo Alvarez, you really have to have some sort of advantages over him, whether it be hand speed and power or also height and reach. I mean, there's very few fighters, in my opinion, that I would bet to actually possibly beat Canelo. In fact, within the 160 to 160 to 175 pound range, I don't know if there's any fighters that I would bet to beat Canelo Alvarez. Not even Archer Beterbiev. And he's a very powerful puncher. He's a gifted fighter. But Canelo, man, Canelo's just on a whole nother level.
Canelo, Terence Crawford has never lost, and although
that's great that he's never lost, but so many people overall that they bring up this point, that's great. But when it comes down to it, and they were trying to bring up the same thing with Vasyl Lomachenko is ranked number one pound for pound, and people love to say, oh, well, Terence Crawford is undefeated and he's unified this division and all that stuff, and and he looks more dominant. But all those are straw man arguments, because if we really want to take a look at things intelligently, Terence Crawford, yeah, sure. First of all, if you want to bring up the unification thing, yeah, that's great that he unified a whole entire division. But let's be real, who did he unify against? He fought Thomas Delorme, who's pretty much lost every big fight in his career. He unified against Thomas Delorme, or he won a vacant title against Thomas Delorme. So that's how he got one of the titles there. The next fight, you beat Victor Postol, who's an okay fighter, but let's be real, Victor Postol, every time that he's fought A-grade fighters, he's pretty much lost. Unless you count that Lucas Matisse win as an A-grade win. And even if we take a look at Lucas Matisse really hasn't beat any A-grade fighters either. So I'm not really sure if he even would count as an A-grade fighter. But it is what it is. Victor Postol is a dude that pretty much has lost every big fight in his career. He lost against Jose Ramirez in a very competitive fight, but I thought at most that was about a draw. He certainly lost to Josh Taylor, and he dominantly lost to Terence Crawford. So Victor Postol, if he is an A-grade fighter, he's on the verge of being an A- to B+ fighter. And in my opinion, I'm not sure if that's a definitive A-class fighter. Victor Postol, in my opinion, he's a decent fighter, but he's not a great fighter. And then, of course, the last fighter you fought was Julius Ndango. Don't even get me started on that Bambi-legged, horrible footwork dude. That guy overall is not that good of a boxer. Don't get me wrong. He won the titles. He won, I believe, a title over Ricky Burns. But once again, Ricky Burns is not an elite opponent. I'm sorry. Ricky Burns, he's never going to be remembered as a dude that, oh my God, Ricky Burns is just this elite caliber opponent. Ricky Burns is not going to be remembered as one of the top 10 pound-for-pound fighters of the generation. Like, let's just stop. People always love the circle jerk over the fact that Terence Crawford, he's dominated these divisions, all that. That's great, but when you really take a look at these divisions, and I give Terence Crawford credit, he beat anyone that they put in front of him. But let's be real. Like, when we take a look at a lot of these opponents, the only possible A-grade opponents that you've ever fought was either Victor Postol or Yuriorkis Gamboa. I don't even count those as A-class fighters. So it is what it is.
Oh,
Like, many people, they always love to bring up how, Canelo Alvarez, how he lost to Floyd Mayweather Jr. That's great, but for me to really use that point to put Terence Crawford over Canelo Alvarez, you would have to argue that Terence Crawford would beat Floyd Mayweather Jr. And it's not like Floyd Mayweather Jr. was like a top 20 pound-for-pound fighter or a top 30 pound-for-pound fighter at the time. Floyd Mayweather Jr. was the #1 undisputed pound-for-pound fighter in the world. So that's great if you want to bring up that point, but at the end of the day, I just don't think that that's enough of an argument, because you would then have to allege that Terence Crawford, that he has a win over a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter in his career, and he just does not. He doesn't.
They'll say that Canelo Alvarez has had better competition than Terence Crawford. I think that has a lot to do with the availability of competition, but at the same time...
Well, Fannon, you have the same energy with Naoya Inoue when it comes down to it, or all in all, you have a completely different energy with Naoya Inoue. You say that you don't take a lot of those smaller guys seriously, especially like a Naoya Inoue. Now, if we really want to go there, if we want to talk about undefeated and overall who looks more dominant, Naoya Inoue looks more dominant, way more dominant at times than Terence Crawford has in his past couple fights. Take a look at the Kell Brook fight. Take a look overall at the Aegis Velasquez fight. Terence Crawford did not look super duper dominant in those fights, even though he got the stoppage. Naoya Inoue, all in all, he debatably sometimes looks like the most dominant boxer in the world. But because of his lack of competition, I could not have him even within my top 6 pound per pound. He's on the lower end of my list. So would Naoya Inoue be above Terence Crawford?
There was 2 fighters which were not super duper high level fighters by a lot of people's, the way that they talk about them, that looked like they beat Canelo, and those being Austin Trout and Erislandy Lara. If you look at...
Austin Trout did not beat Canelo Alvarez. Anyone who knows shit about boxing, who's worth their salt, knows that Austin Trout did not defeat Canelo Alvarez. And you notice how this man did not bring up Gennady Golovkin. Because a lot of these dudes overall, these, pro-black cults, when it comes down to it, and Fannon, I'm not saying that he's as deep into that as the LDBC or new media are, but he's still someone invested in it. That's why they won't bring up Gennady Golovkin, because they have to allege that Gennady Golovkin was a super-duper hype job. Partially because he was a Caucasian fighter, and they couldn't have someone overall ranked that highly as a Caucasian fighter. But on top of that, because Canelo Alvarez was the one that beat him. Now, if Jamal Charlo or Demetrius Andrade was the one that defeated him, what would they be saying about Gennady Golovkin? Oh, they beat an all-time great fighter. That's what they'd be saying. You notice when Andre Ward, when he defeated Sergey Kovalev, there was no controversy about how great of a fighter Sergey Kovalev was. You know what I'm saying? Anyway.
At Terence Crawford's record, what he's done in the ring from 135 pounds to 140 pounds, the dude has been pretty much untouchable, and he's never really been in a fight that was close. Now, there's always, there's obviously the distraction.
That's not true. He fought Yuriorkis Gamboa, which was very, very close. And Gamboa, in my opinion, is not the most skilled fighter in the world. Some people, of course, are going to disagree with that. That's not me saying that he's not highly skilled in certain areas. But Gamboa also is very, very flawed. Even at his best.
Detractors about the competition level that Terence Crawford has fought. But I think if you really look at the time frame, look at it carefully, Terence Crawford at 135 pounds fought the best fighters that were available at 135 pounds because Adrian Brawner had left it.
Yes, he did. But what is that really saying? What are you really saying? I can say overall that I can try to argue that Mike Tyson, that he's a greater heavyweight all around than, let's say, I'm trying to think. Like, I'm trying to argue that Mike Tyson all around, that he's greater than Tyson Fury. Just because Mike Tyson, he held all the belts at one point in time, within his division, and Tyson Fury never did hold all the belts at one point in time. Now, he was a unified champion, but I believe the only belt that he was missing was a WBC belt. I can sit here and try to argue, well, Mike Tyson, he's clearly greater because he had all the belts at one point in time. That's great, but when you take a look at the fighters that he beat, like Trevor Berbick and Pinkelton Thomas and, Tony Tubbs and all these other guys like Frank Bruno, how many of these guys are really going to be looked at as like first ballot Hall of Famers? Like, let's be real. And this is why I say, we can talk shit all day and say that Terence Crawford, oh, he's over these guys because he's never lost and he looks so dominant. That's great, but unless you fight A-class fighters and repeated A-class fighters, I'm not going to know. See, the reason why I knew that Floyd Mayweather Jr. was the number one pound-for-pound fighter at one point in time because Floyd would fight repeated A-class fighters. Terence Crawford is not doing that. So we can talk shit all day, but what if Terence Crawford, what if he loses to Sean Porter? What if he loses? Basically, that'll mean that he has lost the biggest fight of his career. And Sean Porter is a dude that has 3 losses in his career. And of course, certain people, they're going to say, oh, well, there's no way that's going to happen. Well, how do you know? Like I said, of course I have Terence Crawford very high on my pound-for-pound list right now. And if I had to make an early fight prediction, I think that Terence Crawford is going to outbox Porter probably by more than likely unanimous decision. Possibly majority or split decision because, of course, Sean Porter, he gives everyone hell. But when it comes down to the overall, like I said, this is what I like to call Mike Tyson syndrome. Everyone overall, they always said that Mike Tyson, that he was the best heavyweight of the 90s and no one was going to compare to him, and Evander Holyfield, he was going to get stopped. But then what happened? What happened to Mike Tyson when he faced Evander Holyfield and then later on Lennox Lewis? He got beat up by both of them. So that's why you can never allege that Terence is above a Canelo Alvarez just because he looks more dominant. Of course he looks more dominant. What type of competition is he facing? Now, if he is facing repeated A-class fighters, like clear A-class fighters that are like Sean Porter or Danny Garcia and Errol Spence Jr. and Keith Thurman, if he's facing repeated A-class fighters and looks just as dominant or about just as dominant as Canelo Alvarez and remains undefeated, then yes, then you have a point overall to say Terence Crawford is debatably over Canelo Alvarez, but not until.
Division, Ricky Burns and Ray Beltran, the guys that he beat probably were the best guys in that weight division. I know that Amir Khan was there at the time, but Amir Khan had just been coming off, came off of a knockout loss to Breedis Prescott. And after Breedis Prescott had knocked out Amir Khan, Terence Crawford went up to 140 pounds to fight Breedis Prescott and was the underdog in the fight and won that fight. He goes to 140 pounds and he does something that Canelo Alvarez has not been able to do to date, which is become the undisputed champion. And those are just facts. Now, what he's done...
That's great overall. Once again, a lot of these people, they love to circle jerk over how Terence Crawford, how he completely unified a division. Fannon, let me ask you something, because you seem to be a very big fan of Errol Spence Jr. Would you put Terence Crawford over Errol Spence Jr. on the pound-for-pound list? Now, maybe you would. Maybe you would. But would you legitimately say that Terence Crawford has a better resume than Errol Spence Jr. because Errol Spence Jr. has never unified the division completely? Or would you look through that and say, well, you know why that is? Because Terence Crawford, he did not really have that competitive of a division. It is what it is. Don't get me wrong. There are certain fighters out there that still have not unified their division, and the division is still not super-duper competitive, like the 154-pound division. But when it comes down to it overall, the 140-pound division at the time when Terence Crawford unified, I mean, once again, let's be real. Is Julius Ndongo going to beat any A-class fighters in his career? Is Thomas Delorme going to beat any A-class fighters in his career? Is Victor Postol going to defeat any A-class fighters in his career? No, they're not.
At 147 pounds, I was very critical of it, primarily because I'm trying to goad the man and goad boxing into making a good, decent fight that we want to see at that weight class. But, he's been at that weight class for several years now, and nobody's come close to touching him. He's got the Sean Porter fight coming up, and more than likely he's going to win the Sean Porter fight. And for me, if he's able to beat Sean Porter in convincing fashion, that's enough for me to say that this dude is the number one pound-for-pound fighter in the world. I have no idea.
Not me. Sorry. I think that beating Sean Porter, I think that that's a great win, and I think that that's a step in the right direction. The only way, in my opinion, that Terence Crawford is going to become the number one pound-for-pound fighter in the world is if Canelo Alvarez, A, either loses, or B, if Terence Crawford defeats a multitude of A-class fighters, not just one, when it comes down to it, and dominates them. And really, in my opinion, the only way that Terence Crawford is probably going to surpass Canelo Alvarez on the pound-for-pound list, that's if he's able to defeat this dude, is if he beats Errol Spence Jr. Because Canelo Alvarez, he has that win over Gennady Golovkin. And, a lot of people, they're going to say that Gennady, he was this hype job and all sort of bullshit. Gennady, at the end of the day, was ranked top 5 pound for pound on almost every single list. Has Terence Crawford ever had a win like that in his career? No.
Idea how ESPN, or I think is it ESPN and or Ring, both of them have him way down there, number 4, below Monster Inoue, below Alexander Usyk, and below Canelo Alvarez. I just don't think that's right when you look at this dude's skill set in the ring, and I don't mind the dude standing up and saying something about it.
Skill set overall looks great. And guess what? Adrian Broner, once upon a time, he was thought to be one of the most skilled fighters in the world. And then guess what happened every single time he fought an A-grade fighter? He lost. So it is what it is. Now, do I believe that Terence Crawford, do I believe that he'll end up like an Adrian Broner? No, personally I don't. But that's why I say, this is why I call it Mike Tyson syndrome. Because you can never guess that a fighter is over another fighter just off a skill set and how dominant they look. You have to really take a look at the competition. And I'm sorry, but Terence Crawford facing a brisket version of Kell Brook and a person overall who was basically mincemeat after Amir Khan got knocked out 3 times in his career and had his soul taken away by Canelo Alvarez. And facing a Jose Benavidez who was okay but never really that great. And facing a Jeff Horn who was a decent fighter but never really that great. I'm sorry, but am I supposed to be super duper impressed by these wins? Like, Canelo is facing undefeated champions. He's facing guys overall that you can tell are decently talented. Like Billy Joe Saunders, and now Caleb Plant. It is what it is.
And the way that he says something about it may be controversial, but it's true, man. If you test positive for performance-enhancing drugs, that should be taken into consideration when you look at the guy's record. If somebody is caught cheating and somebody is not, who do you give the benefit of the doubt to? But
whoever has the better resume. I understand where Fannon is coming from with that when it comes down, and I do. But to me, the steroids and the PEDs, they're just not enough. It's just not enough. Because, in my opinion, a lot of these fighters are probably on something anyway. They just, they're very good at hiding it. So it is what it is. But anyway.
And the way that a lot of these, ESPN and Ring Magazine and these guys are going to carry this, it's almost like they act like there's no comparison between anybody and Canelo Alvarez. So
there almost isn't. I mean, when you take a look at any other fighter today, if there's any fighters that could debatably be number 1 pound for pound over Canelo Alvarez, the only 2 that I could possibly see, at least as of right now, would either be Alexander Usyk or Errol Spence Jr. Those would be the only other 2. I don't see any other fighters that could possibly be up there with Canelo. And to be honest with you, I don't even think those other fighters are as skilled as Canelo. I mean, Usyk, I think that he does have better feet than Canelo, so maybe for his division, maybe he's more skilled than Canelo. One could debate, but that would be a very, very uphill battle if you were trying to debate that. It is what it is. Usyk is a very talented fighter, though, no doubt about it. But when it comes down to it overall, like I said, even if Canelo is not the number 1 pound for pound fighter, I cannot have Terence Crawford within my top 3, even if we're not counting Canelo. I can't have him over Alexander Usyk. I can't have him over Errol Spence Jr. I can't have him over Tyson Fury, because every single one of those guys have a top 10 pound for pound win. Terence has never had that. And I'm sorry, but you can never be in the conversation, at least in my opinion, as the number 1 pound for pound fighter when you've never had one top 10 pound for pound win.
idea that Terence Crawford would think he deserved to be number one pound for pound to these guys, they're going to blow it off anyway. And actually, man, the funny thing is that when Canelo got suspended, right, Canelo Alvarez was taken off those pound for pound lists after he had been suspended. And it was Vasily Lomachenko that was the number one pound for pound fighter in the world. And there was a lot of talk about who was the number one.
And a lot of people, they're spreading this narrative that Terence Crawford, that he's not ranked number one pound for pound just because he's a black fighter, and they don't want a black fighter to be the number one pound for pound. I understand where they're coming from, but if you have a realistic scope on things and aren't looking at things from a racial or emotional standpoint, because let's be real, once again, a lot of these dudes, including Fannon, a lot of these guys have a very, very, very big racial investment or very emotional racial way of looking at things. So you cannot really rely on them to be overly intelligent in certain conversations like this, because their immediate reaction is going to be over emotional. It is what it is. When we take a look at Vasily Lomachenko, when he was ranked number one pound for pound, he was ranked number one pound for pound finally when he beat Jorge Linares. And I had no problem with that, because Jorge Linares at the time was the number one 135 pounder in the world. And Lomachenko knocked his ass out. He had became a three-weight division champion. He looked like the most dominant fighter in the world. And on top of that, he also completely smacked Guillermo Rigondeaux, who was a top 10 pound for pound fighter at the time. But it is what it is. Now, of course, some people, they'll say that, well, Guillermo Rigondeaux, there was an obvious size disadvantage there against Vasily Lomachenko. That's fair. But at the end of the day, a lot of people looked at that as a 50-50 fight. And Lomachenko pretty much smacked that boy around. It is what it is. And if you also want to go there, then you have to bring up the same thing with Terence Crawford. Because Terence Crawford's biggest win to this day is still Yuriorkis Gamboa, who very clearly was smaller. So it is what it is.
Pound for pound guy was a Terence Crawford or was a Vasily Lomachenko. So, it didn't miss me that Vasily Lomachenko loses to Teofimo Lopez, and all of a sudden he drops off the pound for pound list, but Canelo Alvarez.
And that's why, in my opinion, when people overall had Vasily Lomachenko number one and Terence at number two, I always disagreed. Because when I took a look at that win that Canelo had over Gennady Golovkin and then over Danny Jacobs, there was just no way that Terence Crawford could be above Canelo on my pound for pound list. No way. No way. And now there's other fighters overall. Yes, you can be superseded if you're not making any progress. And I'm sorry, but what has Terence Crawford really done for the past 4 years? What have you done? The best win that you have for the past 4 years is over Jeff Horn, who, some would even debate is a C-class fighter. Yes, he had that decent win over Manny Pacquiao, but do any of us really think that Jeff Horn would have beaten a Sean Porter or a Danny Garcia or even a Yordenis Ugas? Let's be real. Now, once again, that's a little bit hypothetical, but go ahead and take a look at Jeff Horn's career after he lost to Terence Crawford. Go ahead and take a look at it. He hasn't been anything.
Jumps back on top of it, and Terence Crawford, even though he's not lost at all, finds a way to drop below both not only Canelo Alvarez but below Monster Inoue and below.
Well, there's no way, in my opinion, that Inoue can be above Terence Crawford, because Inoue, he just has not fought anybody. At least Terence Crawford has some debatable A-grade fighters on his resume. Inoue, I mean, what fighters do you know on his resume that you can say, wow, that's really a debatable A-grade fighter? At least with Terence, you can debate that Victor Postol and Gamboa maybe were debatable A-class wins, but goddamn, Inoue has almost nobody on his resume.
And below Alexander Usyk as well. So,
Alexander Usyk is ahead of Terence Crawford.
Honestly,
because he looks more dominant than Terence Crawford. He actually looks more skilled than Terence Crawford in certain fights. And on top of that, Alexander Usyk has that A-grade win, that A-plus win, in my opinion, over Anthony Joshua. So, yes, Alexander Usyk has to be ranked above Terence Crawford at this moment in time.
I commend Terence Crawford for this, man, because that takes a lot of truth for him to say that, right? And clearly it's under his skin that he's not getting the respect that he deserves. He also said some stuff about...
I think that he's getting the exact respect that he deserves. I mean, you're not going to ever be ranked number one pound for pound until you start really facing these A-grade fighters. Now, if Terence Crawford, if he's starting to beat, Keith Thurman and Sean Porter and Danny Garcia and especially Errol Spence Jr., and he doesn't start moving up on the pound for pound list, then I can maybe understand. But Terence is getting the exact amount of respect that he deserves. In fact, he may actually be getting a little bit too much, Because for the resume that you have, I'm sorry, but the best fighter that you've ever beaten was a Yuriorkis Gamboa. I'm sorry, but that does not scream #1 pound for pound fighter to me.
About Errol Spence Jr. and how he's tired of people comparing him to Errol Spence Jr. because all Errol Spence Jr. has ever had is 2 belts in his whole career, where Terence Crawford has had more. I thought it's
right, but those 2 belts that Errol Spence Jr. has were much more hard work or have so much more meaning than Terence Crawford's whole entire belts throughout his whole entire career. And a certain amount of people, they're not going to agree with that. But who do you think, all in all, is the better fighters at the end of the day? Do you think that Kell Brook at his prime and Sean Porter at his prime, do you think they're better fighters overall than Terence Crawford's whole entire resume? Let's just be real, they pretty much are. At the end of the day, is Victor Postol or Yuriorkis Gamboa, even if they were in the same division, do you think those fighters beat a Sean Porter or a Kell Brook in their prime? No. It is what it is.
Terence Crawford on his 6th. I think he's got 6 belts versus Errol Spence Jr.'s 2 belts. But I mean, at the real, I don't know how you can count that. Like, the fact of the matter is that Errol Spence Jr. has half of the belts in the weight division that Terence Crawford has been fighting in for the last 3, almost pushing off 4 years, but definitely been there a solid 3 years. And Terence Crawford has not figured out a way to get his hand on the 2nd belt. So I ain't buying what he's saying.
That's interesting. So you have that energy with Errol Spence Jr. All of a sudden, when it comes to Errol Spence Jr., all of a sudden you're much more intelligent. All of a sudden, you see, the forest beyond the trees. Isn't that interesting? And also when it comes to Deontay Wilder, he has a completely different energy as well. That's interesting.
About Errol Spence Jr. Of course, people want Terence Crawford to fight Errol Spence Jr. It's a great fight, and people want to see it. But as far as like
that fight is not going to happen unless Terence Crawford humbles himself. He's not going to get a 50-50 split. I don't give a shit who you face. Maybe if you face Keith Thurman before Errol Spence can get to him. But even then, Keith Thurman, I'm not going to say that he's done at this point in time in his career, but Keith Thurman suffered a loss in his last fight. And I'm not really sure where Keith Thurman is at this point in time in his career. So we'll see what happens.
The mythical pound for pound conversations and all of that stuff. I think that, there's several people that can make arguments for it. If you're a Canelo Alvarez fan, you'll pretty much sweep the performance enhancing drug test under the rug and just say, well, he test positive once and it was the beat and it was the food, and you'll buy that excuse. But clearly Terence Crawford ain't buying that excuse.
I don't think overall that I believe the meat excuse either. These boxers, they have a lot of organic foods to make sure that no one is fucking with their shit. And the amount that Canelo Alvarez had in his system, it was very obvious that he was purposely taking PEDs. No problem with saying that. But at the end of the day, that's just not enough for me to put Terence Crawford over Canelo.
And honestly, man, I don't see how anybody else is going to buy that excuse. If Terence Crawford had tested positive for the exact same thing.
The only way when it came down to it, if that excuse even would be somewhat viable, is if Terence Crawford and Canelo Alvarez, if they were similarly dominant, and overall they pretty much were similar in almost every single category. And I just said, you know what? Whoever I have on, as the #1 pound for pound fighter, it's really hard to debate and it's almost a coin toss. Then I can maybe say, okay, well, the PEDs, since he's on PEDs, maybe then I can fault him a little bit there, or since he was on PEDs and there's no proof of it right now. But once again, of course, then maybe I can, rank him down a little bit. But the problem is that Canelo versus Terence Crawford, when you talk about a pound for pound ranking, that's not even a coin toss. Like, Canelo Alvarez so clearly beats Terence Crawford in almost every category. That's not even close.
Wouldn't nobody be cutting that dude a break whatsoever? At least that's the way that I see it. I don't think that they would be cutting him a break, but they're willing to cut Canelo Alvarez a break because you can't tear down the guy that's going to be paying your rent, right? So Canelo Alvarez is a big draw.
Well, Fannon, he tries to make this point overall that Canelo, the reason why, he's ranked so highly is because he's so marketable. And that's great to a certain degree. I understand that, but at the end of the day, we have to also take a look at his accomplishments. Canelo Alvarez is a 4-weight division champion. He's 1 belt away from completely unifying a very talented division when it comes down to it. And how many A-class fighters and champions has Canelo Alvarez fought? I mean, come on. He defeated Austin Trout. He defeated Arasani Lara. He defeated Gennady Golovkin. He defeated Sergey Kovalev. He defeated Billy Joe Saunders. He defeated Callum Smith. He defeated Danny Jacobs. You know, he defeated Miguel Cotto. He defeated all those guys, man. Like, all those guys that I just listed off the top of my head, all those guys are A-class fighters. Every single one. At least they were when they were at that point in time in their career. Even Sergey Kovalev, who was a little bit more wore down. He had 2 very good wins, you know, coming into that fight, and he was a champion.
Big money guy. He's a big money guy for the WBC. He's a big money guy for whatever promoter or whatever other fighter may get a chance to fight at him. But I mean, it still remains to be there, man. That's what happened to him, and it's just a mark on his record that is going to stay on there. And anybody that wants to be compared, anybody that wants to be compared to him in that type of mythical list is going to feel some type of way about that because.
Well, I think that they will, and I don't necessarily have a problem with what Terence Crawford, said. I understand, but when it comes down to it, for those of us that, once again, are looking on the outside, looking in, and for those of us that are really looking how to rank things logically and objectively, we all know that Canelo Alvarez is over Terence Crawford. I'm sorry.
Terence Crawford, for everything anybody knows, is a clean fighter. And so if he feels like somebody else is getting accolades or being able to move up multiple weight classes with the help of steroids and he's not doing it, it's reasonable for him to get a little upset about it. But in my opinion, I think Terence Crawford is the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world. If Canelo Alvarez, but at the same time, if Canelo Alvarez had never tested positive for it, I would be saying
the only way Terence Crawford is going to be ranked the #1 pound-for-pound fighter on my list is if he defeats Errol Spence Jr. I really don't see any other way. Because Canelo Alvarez, he already has so many big wins in his career. Even if he were to beat Keith Thurman and Sean Porter and Danny Garcia, that's great. But those guys, they're not champions at this point in time. So it is what it is.
It was Canelo Alvarez. But anyway, that's my take on the situation. You let me know what you think in the comment section. And with that, I'm out. Peace.
And that's really about it for this video. I just thought that I would talk on that because I thought that it was a very interesting conversation. Once again, to me, even though PEDs, of course, I don't overall say that they're a great thing. I don't commend them when it comes down to it. At the end of the day, Canelo, you can tell, is the #1 pound-for-pound fighter. Not just based off of skill set and dominance, but his resume. There's no other resume out there, in my opinion, that can even compare. It is what it is. But anyways, when it comes down to it, that's really about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. And I'll talk to you all later. And we'll see what Mr. Terence Crawford does November 20th against Sean Porter. We'll also see what happens for Mr. Canelo Alvarez November 6th against Caleb Plant. Those are going to be 2 great fights. So we'll see what happens. Anyways, that's about it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you all later.